I want to talk today about words that give me the willies. These are words that we use all the time, but that I am never quite comfortable with. The prime example is the word worship. Now, I am a worship associate here at UUCP, and today I am the worship leader. And what we do here together, we call a worship service. But honestly, that word has bothered me for the 20 plus years that I have been here. Clearly, I have accommodated to it, but I have had to work at it. Now, before digging into that, I want to acknowledge straight out that I am going to be speaking from my own experience and way of looking at the world. And so I approach this topic with a sense of humility. I don't expect that all of us here see things the way I do, of course not. I just hope that my experience is sufficiently common to be useful. Some background. I grew up in the Midwest in a family that had been Presbyterian for some generations, and we took our particular variant of Protestant Christianity fairly seriously. My dad was an elder in the church. I went through confirmation class when I was 13 and joined the church after that. I tended to believe what I was told. We said the Apostles' Creed every week. Now, my doubts about the claims of Christianity grew as I did. And so I was agnostic by the time I entered college and a science curriculum. Later, after college, I spent 2 years in the Peace Corps, living in Malaysia, a multi-ethnic country with Muslims and Hindus and Confucians and very few Christians. So by the time I was 25, I had seen worship manifested in many, many ways. Now, I consider myself a humanist and still agnostic and not atheist, because to me to be atheist is to assert a certainty that I'm not quite willing to claim. Now, the point of that idiosyncratic history is that many words have religious connotations for me that are deeply wired in my neurons. Connotations primarily from my Christian upbringing, and connotations that I really don't particularly care for nowadays. It's a form of bias, not unlike the racial and gender bias that I also grew up with and have been trying to dispel. Okay, so how have I come to terms with the word worship? As a verb, it takes an object. You worship something. What then? A deity? Deities? Well, that doesn't work for me. So, go back to the origin. The word comes from an old English word meaning worthiness, acknowledgement of worth. For me, to worship is to pay attention to that which is most worthy, that which is most worthy of your attention and devotion. You have to decide what that is. As Bob Dylan wrote, you got to serve somebody. What is it you are serving? As a UU, the reason I come to something called a worship service is to ask myself that question, and to be challenged to ask myself that question, and then to be challenged, so what are you going to do about it? It's hard to do that work by myself. By coming to the service, I am coming into the presence of others who can help me answer those questions. The notion of that which is most worthy also helps me with the words spiritual and spirituality, words I hear in a lot of contexts. Now, for me, the word spirit carries the connotation of soul, something separate from the body and potentially persistent beyond the life of the body. And that connotation discomforts me. However, spirit comes from the word for breath, which is fundamental to life. So I can think of a spiritual practice as one that helps a person strip away the distractions and minutiae and connect to life's fundamentals. To me, to be spiritual is to engage with the core of what is most fundamental to life. Nevertheless, spirit has broader meanings that I try to be open to. When we sing, "Spirit of Life, Come Unto Me," as we just did, there's a sense of something ineffable that I can't put neatly into a materialistic box. There is a unity and wonder to nature, and to the mystery of being alive and being aware of it. And these things, I think, are better elicited by music and poetry than certainly my rationalizations. I try not to be too tempted by the comfort of certainty. Might there be a spirit of life that is more than a poetic metaphor? Maybe. In 1927, J.B.S. Haldane wrote, "Now, my own suspicion is that the universe is queerer than we suppose. And not only that, but queerer than we can suppose." Now, that was before the discovery of black holes, dark energy, dark matter, quantum entanglement, and all kinds of weird things. And also before the subsequent evolution of the word queer, which is another example of words having multiple meanings and evolving meanings. Best to be flexible. Two more words that have given me pause: faith and religion. I saw something from the UU minister, Galen Gingrich, that helped me with those. He writes, "Faith is not a product of reason or knowledge or evidence or even of experience, although each of these plays an important role. Faith is a leap of the moral imagination. Faith looks at what is and believes in what might be. Religion is the collection of external forms that we use: songs, symbols, stories, rituals, obligations, sacred spaces, to carry our faith along from day to day and generation to generation." This notion of religion being a collective activity is really helpful to me. I've come to consider myself as a religious humanist, which may sound self-contradictory if you think of religion as necessarily implying belief in a deity. But consider this description from all-knowing Wikipedia. "Religious humanism is an integration of humanist ethical philosophy with congregational rites and community activity." Well, I'm down with that. Congregational rites and community activity. Songs, symbols, stories, rituals, obligations, sacred spaces. These things that carry our faith along from day to day, person to person, and generation to generation. With that understanding, I can consider myself a religious person. Longtime member Roy Miller conducts a discussion group about great UU sermons, and he recently highlighted one from 2009 by our previous minister, Reverend Susan Frederick Gray. Quoting a paragraph from that, "Over the past generation, as Christian fundamentalism rose in power and public influence, our congregations became safe havens in which we too often circled the horses and drew inward, enjoying the religious liberalism we found within the congregation, but guarding it jealously, even fearfully. In response to the growing influence of religious conservatism in public life, we pulled in the opposite direction, becoming wary of associating ourselves in any way with religion." One of our ministers, she writes, shared with me how just a few months ago, a member of her congregation asked her, "Now, you're not one of those people who thinks Unitarian Universalism is a religion, do you?" Indeed I am, that minister proudly declared. So, is what we share a religion? How do you feel about that word? One etymology of the word religion takes us back to the Latin, re, meaning again, and ligare, meaning to bind. In a word, or in a metaphor, to bind back again that which had been separated. We could do with more binding and less separation. Another word that UUCP has a definite history with is church. In 1947, our founders incorporated as the first Unitarian Church of Phoenix. We later became the first Unitarian Universalist Church of Phoenix. And then in 1997, we voted to name the congregation the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Phoenix. At least in part because several members from non-Christian backgrounds questioned the use of the word church in our name. When I arrived in 1999, there was a consistent, I would say almost strident, emphasis on using congregation instead of church. That has diminished over time, at least partially because church is one syllable and easier to say. But still, I think the concern is valid. Now, church comes easily to me because that's how I grew up. But a friend here from a Jewish background once asked me how I would feel if people routinely referred to going to temple. Ah, I got it. That was a useful invitation to stand in another's shoes. It's a matter of inclusivity, which is a word that now has become quite prominent in our lexicon. So my habit is to use congregation still, but I don't see us demanding its use the way we did 20 years ago. Thank goodness, we can cut each other some slack. There are a number of other words we could talk about, and I hope to have a discussion group in the fall on this topic. For example, what does it mean and what does it take for something to be holy? In coffee hour today, I suggest you might talk about worship, religion, and such words and see what thoughts people have. But to stir the pot a bit more, I'd like to turn from words we use to words we seldom, if ever, use, because they collectively make us very uncomfortable. Here's the main one. Brace yourself. Sin. I don't have a good handle on that one. Although we talk a lot about injustice and oppression, appropriately so, I don't think I've ever heard them described here as being sins, or that they're the consequence of humanity's sinful nature. That really goes against our universalist heritage. And maybe it wouldn't be helpful. Maybe if we are looking for reasons for bad behavior, it's enough to focus on psychology to explain why people do what they do. And also to think about how to have them change the way they act. And maybe that word sin is too much like cholla cactus for many of us. There's just no way to get close without getting hurt. But it bothers me that we never set aside time, either in our weekly service or during the year, to acknowledge the times that we fall short, when either by acts of omission or commission, we individually have failed to be who we want to be. We don't have to call them sins or to submerge in guilt, but it would be healthy to face them. How would you feel about having an invitation each week to silently reflect on our own shortcomings? There's a question for discussion. Personally, I at least would like us to see something annually, an equivalent to the Jewish Day of Atonement. How can we improve the world if we don't improve ourselves? There is a poem by Marge Piercy called Many, Many Loves that ends with these lines. Some, the luckiest, can love themselves without narcissism, just saying, well, I am this. I could do better now, and probably I will. Here's a triad of words we seldom hear but may belong in our UU vocabulary: confession, forgiveness, and grace. Grace is forgiveness given unearned. Grace is what we need to show each other. We come here from many different backgrounds, carrying different burdens. Sometimes we will make each other uncomfortable. We should, otherwise we're not learning. The discomfort is an opportunity. I heard a good phrase last month at General Assembly: be curious, not furious. I have focused today on words from my Christian background, but there are certainly words and phrases from contemporary UU culture that may make some of us uncomfortable. I confess my first reaction to the suggestion that I specify my preferred pronouns was, what? Why? We learn. Another phrase I learned from General Assembly: some religions are like a stone, others like a river. Let's be a river, rapids and all. We started talking about worship. So what do we do together in this UUCP worship service? How are we to be a spiritual community for our time? I have come to think of it this way. We come together to attend to those things most worthy of our attention, to struggle with difficult times and difficult words, to support each other with grace and love, and to try to level up and to experience the holy. May it be so.